"Ma'am, this section is reserved for first-class passengers." The flight attendant's voice is crisp, polite, too polite. But the tight smile and lingering glance make the insult clear. Michelleobama lifts an eyebrow, her composure unshaken. She's been here before, dismissed, underestimated. But this, on a flight she rightfully belongs in. The murmurs around her grow louder, passengers shifting uncomfortably. Does she let this moment pass, or does she remind the flight attendant exactly who she just disrespected? What would you do if someone tried to diminish your presence? Have you ever been unfairly judged based on appearances? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from? Like and subscribe to see how Michelle's response leaves everyone speechless. The luxury international flight sat poised for takeoff, its first-class cabin radiating opulence and exclusivity. Rows of wide, plush seats in neutral tones promised comfort, while champagne glasses shimmered in the soft cabin lighting. Passengers settled in, each embodying the quiet air of privilege that accompanied such spaces. Some flipped through newspapers or tapped away on their laptops, while others reclined with the ease of familiarity. The hum of polite conversation filled the space, blending with the subtle rustle of designer bags and the clinking of glasses. As the flight attendants moved gracefully down the aisle, their polished smiles and attentive service reinforced the illusion of perfection. Yet, beneath this polished exterior, something less refined brewed, an unspoken tension that often clung to spaces of exclusivity. It wasn't overt or loud, but a quiet unease born of the subtle divides that could make even the most elegant setting uncomfortable for some. Among the passengers sat individuals from diverse backgrounds, their presence contrasting with the traditional image of first-class travelers. Some blended seamlessly into the scene, while others stood out, whether by their demeanor, attire, or the watchful gazes of others. The differences, though unstated, were palpable, a reminder that privilege often came with invisible boundaries. Not everyone could cross. As the cabin crew bustled about, their professional masks betrayed no hint of bias, yet small cracks in the facade began to show. A slightly shorter greeting here, a moment of hesitance there, barely noticeable but enough to set the stage for what was to come. The energy in the cabin shifted slightly, the quiet murmurs interrupted occasionally by subtle glances exchanged. Between passengers, the flight had barely begun, and yet the atmosphere hinted at the tension simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Michelleobama sat quietly in her window seat, her hands resting lightly on the book she planned to read during the flight. She had perfected the art of traveling unnoticed when she could, though her stature and presence often commanded attention. Her calm demeanor, paired with the genuine warmth in her smile, radiated humility despite the global recognition she carried. Passengers who glanced her way seemed momentarily taken aback, a flicker of acknowledgement passing over their faces before they turned back to their own routines. As Michelle watched the bustle of the crew and passengers, her thoughts drifted inward. She had long learned to carry herself with poise in spaces where her presence wasn't always welcomed or fully understood. The first-class cabin was no exception, a space that often bore unspoken expectations of who belonged and who didn't. She had felt these silent judgments before, and though they stung, she had never let them define her. Michelle reflected on the many times she had been underestimated, dismissed, or reduced to a stereotype. She had overcome those moments with grace and resilience, her actions proving her worth to those unwilling or unable to see it from the start. Today, she resolved, would be no different. Her smile remained warm as a passenger passed, nodding politely in acknowledgement. Regardless of the challenges this flight might hold, she reminded herself of one unshakable truth. Her value was never dictated by anyone else's perception. Amanda moved through the first-class cabin with practiced ease, her smile polished and her demeanor friendly. She greeted passengers warmly, her tone upbeat and attentive as she ensured their needs were met. Her polished professionalism seemed unwavering, an image of the ideal flight attendant. She chatted briefly with a middle-aged man in a tailored suit, laughed lightly with a woman juggling her toddler, and delivered impeccable service to everyone she encountered. But as Amanda approached Michelleobama's row, something shifted. Her warm smile faded, replaced by a look of indifference so subtle it might have gone unnoticed by someone less attuned to these quiet changes. Michelle's polite request for a glass of water was met with a curt nod, Amanda's voice clipped and flat. "I'll get to you when I can," she muttered, barely making eye contact before moving to the next row. Amanda's interactions with the other passengers, by contrast, remained lively and enthusiastic. She offered champagne to a couple nearby with a glowing smile and an exaggerated cheeriness that seemed almost performative. Yet, when it came to Michelle, Amanda's tone remained cool, her responses brief and dismissive. Though Amanda never voiced her assumptions, they were clear in her actions. To her, Michelle didn't quite fit in first class. The subtle microaggressions, her icy tone, the lack of eye contact, and her deliberate indifference spoke volumes about the quiet prejudice she harbored beneath her polished exterior. James, an older gentleman seated across the aisle, adjusted his glasses as he observed Amanda's interactions with the passengers. His warm, discerning eyes softened when they landed on Michelle. He recognized her almost instantly, not just her face, but the quiet dignity with which she carried herself. James had seen enough in his life to recognize the subtlety of Amanda's behavior. His frown deepened as he watched the flight attendant briskly dismiss Michelle's simple request, then turned to serve another passenger with exaggerated enthusiasm. He leaned back in his seat, considering whether he should say something. James had never been one to shy away from speaking his mind, but he understood that timing mattered. For now, he resolved to stay watchful, his quiet disapproval unmistakable to anyone paying attention. Meanwhile, Laura, one of Amanda's co-workers, lingered at the edge of the aisle. She had seen it all: Amanda's curt responses, her refusal to meet Michelle's eyes, and the exaggerated friendliness with everyone else. Laura shifted uncomfortably, torn between her instinct to step in and the fear of creating a scene. She felt a knot in her stomach as she turned away, choosing now to remain silent. Around Michelle, passengers began whispering. "Did you see how she ignored her?" one murmured to another. "Isn't that Michelleobama?" The tension was palpable, but despite their murmurs, no one dared to speak up just yet. The moment hung heavy in the air, waiting for someone to break it. Amanda continued her rounds with a polished grace, her smile unwavering as she attended to the first-class passengers. She leaned over to offer a champagne refill to a man in a tailored suit, laughing at his light-hearted joke. Her demeanor was vibrant, almost glowing, as she reassured a young woman traveling with a restless toddler. Every interaction seemed effortless, a masterclass in attentiveness and charm. Then Amanda reached Michelle. Michelle glanced up with her usual warmth, her voice steady yet kind as she asked, "Could I have a glass of water, please?" Amanda barely paused, her smile vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "I'm busy right now," she replied curtly, her tone clipped, and moved on without another word. Michelle blinked, the slight sting of the dismissal flickering across her face. She adjusted her posture, folding her hands calmly, as though willing herself not to react. Amanda's behavior grew more deliberate as the flight progressed. She continued to engage warmly with other passengers, her tone light and enthusiastic. When Michelle tried to catch her attention again, Amanda dismissed her with a terse, "We'll get to you soon," before turning away. The flight attendant never made eye contact, her indifference unmistakable. Michelle remained poised, but the faint hurt in her eyes was hard to miss. The silent snub rippled through her, the subtle discrimination stirring a deeper frustration, one that she had long learned to hide behind grace and composure. As Amanda walked away, Michelle's gaze lingered on the back of the flight attendant's uniform, her thoughts swirling. She had encountered this kind of dismissal before, a quiet kind of prejudice that didn't shout but whispered, subtle enough to be easily denied, yet loud enough to be felt. It was the small things, the way Amanda avoided her eyes, the tone that lacked warmth, the deliberate neglect disguised as busyness. Michelle took a deep breath, steadying herself. She thought back to countless moments like this, moments when she'd been underestimated or excluded, even as a young girl growing up on the south side of Chicago. She remembered her parents' words, teaching her to stay strong, to rise above those who tried to diminish her worth. But it didn't make the sting any less sharp. Her instincts urged her to call out Amanda's behavior, to demand the same respect afforded to the other passengers. Yet she hesitated. She knew that her actions were never just her own. They carried weight, reflecting the larger fight for dignity and equality. So she resolved, as always, to maintain her composure. It wasn't weakness, it was power. Michelle understood that sometimes grace could be the loudest answer to disrespect, and she chose to let her strength speak louder than her frustration. Have you ever felt dismissed because of your identity? What emotions did it stir in you? Share your thoughts in the comments. Michelle sat quietly, her calm demeanor unwavering as Amanda made her way through the cabin. When Amanda passed her row, Michelle spoke up with her usual kindness, her tone polite yet unassuming. "Excuse me, could I have a glass of water, please?" Without breaking her stride or even glancing in Michelle's direction, Amanda replied curtly, "We're busy right now," and continued down the aisle. Her voice was sharp, devoid of the warmth she had so generously given to others. Michelle blinked, momentarily taken aback, before composing herself. She watched as Amanda approached the passenger in the next row, her attitude shifting immediately. The man, seated comfortably in his tailored suit, requested another glass of champagne. Amanda flashed a bright smile, her tone suddenly cheerful. "Of course, let me take care of that for you," she said, leaning in with practiced attentiveness. Michelle couldn't help but notice the stark difference. The same request met with a warmth and energy she had not been afforded. Michelle's thoughts swirled as she tried to rationalize the interaction. Maybe Amanda was just overwhelmed or distracted. Maybe it wasn't personal, but as the flight progressed, the pattern became undeniable. Each time Michelle sought assistance, be it for a glass of water, a blanket, or even a simple question, Amanda's responses were dismissive, curt, and indifferent. Yet Amanda's demeanor remained bright and engaging with the other passengers. She laughed warmly with a young mother trying to calm her toddler, reassured an elderly woman about the in-flight meal options, and offered extra pillows to a couple seated nearby. To everyone else, Amanda was the picture of professionalism. But with Michelle, her indifference was palpable. The subtle sting of each rejection settled heavily on Michelle's shoulders. She shifted in her seat, glancing out the window as she fought to push down the discomfort. This wasn't the first time she had been treated as though she didn't belong, but it didn't make it easier. She adjusted her posture, straightening her shoulders, determined to maintain her composure. The dismissals were small, almost imperceptible to anyone not paying attention, but to Michelle they spoke volumes. Each slight was a reminder of the biases she had faced her entire life, a subtle but constant undercurrent that questioned her presence in spaces like this. As Amanda moved through the cabin, her dismissive attitude toward Michelle did not go unnoticed. Passengers seated nearby began to exchange puzzled glances, their murmurs breaking the usual hum of quiet conversation in first class. One man, sitting a few rows ahead, leaned slightly toward his seatmate. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his tone curious but hesitant. She didn't even stop to listen to her. His companion, a middle-aged woman with a sharp eye for detail, glanced over at Michelle. "You're right," she replied softly. She just brushed her off. "But look how attentive she's being with everyone else." Her lips pressed into a thin line as she shook her head. "Do you think it's intentional?" A younger man, seated across the aisle, caught part of their conversation. He tilted his head, observing Amanda's behavior more closely now. The pattern was hard to miss. Michelle, seated quietly at her window, seemed to draw none of the warmth or attention that Amanda lavished on other passengers. "It looks deliberate to me," the man muttered under his breath, though he made no move to intervene. Meanwhile, James, seated just a few rows behind Michelle, watched the entire scene unfold with growing discomfort. He had noticed Amanda's sharp tone and how she seemed to avoid Michelle's gaze altogether. His brow furrowed and he tapped his fingers against the armrest, clearly troubled. He wanted to say something, but he hesitated, unsure of the best way to approach the situation. Without escalating it, the whispers began to spread as more passengers picked up on the unequal treatment. A woman in the row behind Michelle leaned toward her partner, murmuring, "Isn't that Michelleobama? Why is the attendant acting like this?" Her partner shrugged, his expression a mix of confusion and unease. "I don't know. It doesn't seem right." Despite the growing murmurs of concern, no one spoke up. The tension in the cabin became palpable, an unspoken weight pressing down on everyone. People were aware, but hesitation held them back, each person waiting for someone else to make the first move. Michelle sat quietly in her seat, her hands resting lightly on her lap as Amanda moved through the cabin with deliberate indifference. She had made only a simple request for water, something as small and unassuming as a passenger could ask, but Amanda's refusal had been sharp, almost rehearsed. Michelle could feel the weight of the slight pressing against her chest. Yet, she remained composed, her outward demeanor betraying none of the frustration swirling within her. She let her gaze drift to the window, watching the clouds as her mind churned with thoughts she wished she could ignore. Moments like these were all too familiar. The small, deliberate ways people dismissed her, ways they assumed she didn't belong, were painful reminders of battles she had fought her entire life. But those battles had taught her something invaluable. Reacting impulsively often gave people like Amanda exactly what they wanted, and Michelle wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. Internally, she grappled with a quiet storm, frustration mingled with a lingering hurt that she knew she couldn't afford to dwell on. She wanted to call out Amanda's behavior, to address the injustice in the moment, but she also understood the broader implications of every action she took. Her voice, her presence, it carried weight. A single misstep, no matter how justified, could overshadow the truth of the situation, so she chose grace. She sat straighter in her seat, letting her posture speak for her. She smiled at the passenger seated across the aisle, who nodded back in recognition and quiet solidarity. She met the stares of others with a calm resolve that conveyed strength. Even if her heart felt heavy, but Amanda's boldness only seemed to grow. Each interaction became more pointed, her tone sharper, her dismissals more obvious. It was as if she believed Michelle's silence meant she was powerless, someone unworthy of first-class treatment, or worse, unworthy of her time. Michelle felt the sting of that assumption, but she refused to let it show. Instead, she leaned into her inner resolve, knowing that her quiet grace spoke louder than any words she could utter in that moment. In the face of Amanda's disrespect, Michelle's dignity remained unshaken. Back in the galley, Amanda leaned against the counter, her polished facade slipping slightly as she spoke in a hushed tone to her co-worker, Laura. "Did you see her?" Amanda muttered, gesturing subtly toward the first-class cabin with a nod of her head. "She just doesn't belong up here. I mean, she looks so out of place." Laura's eyes widened slightly, her body tensing as the words sank in. She glanced toward the cabin, her gaze lingering on Michelle for a moment before she turned. Back to Amanda. "I don't think that's really our place to say," Laura replied softly, her voice hesitant. She didn't want to escalate things, but Amanda's comment had left a sour taste in her mouth. Amanda waved her hand dismissively, her tone laced with quiet arrogance. "Come on, you know what I mean," she said. "It's not just about appearances, it's an attitude. She's acting like she owns the place." Her voice lowered further, as though she was sharing some great secret. "People like her always think they deserve special treatment." Laura's discomfort deepened, and she turned back to the counter, pretending to busy herself with stacking cups. "Maybe she's just being polite," she said, her words cautious, but Amanda didn't seem to hear or care. As Amanda returned to the cabin, her demeanor shifted further. Her microaggressions became more deliberate, more overt. She avoided Michelle's row entirely, making it clear she wasn't willing to engage with her. Her body language screamed indifference, from the way she looked past Michelle when she spoke to how she served other passengers with exaggerated warmth. The cabin's atmosphere grew heavier with each passing moment. The passengers weren't blind to Amanda's behavior. They could see the sharp contrast between her cheerful professionalism with others and the cold, calculated disregard she reserved for Michelle. Whispers began to spread, their curiosity and disapproval feeding the growing tension. Amanda's bias, though unspoken to most, was obvious in every interaction. She had made up her mind that Michelle didn't belong, and her actions reflected that assumption. But what Amanda failed to see was the ripple effect of her behavior as the quiet tension in the cabin continued to grow. As Michelle sat quietly in her seat, the sting of Amanda's dismissive behavior lingered, and her thoughts began to drift. It wasn't just this moment. It was the weight of so many others like it that settled on her chest. The way Amanda treated her felt familiar, a painful echo of experiences she had endured throughout her life. She thought back to her childhood on the south side of Chicago, where she was often told what she couldn't or shouldn't do. "You're aiming too high," a guidance counselor had once said when she voiced her dream of attending Princeton. The words had stung deeply, not because she doubted herself, but because they revealed how little others believed in her potential. It wasn't just an isolated moment. It was part of a larger pattern, a reflection of how society often tried to limit what she could achieve. Her mind jumped to her early career as a lawyer, walking into boardrooms where her presence was met with raised eyebrows. She remembered the subtle yet undeniable feeling of being scrutinized, of needing to prove herself over and over again just to be treated as an equal. Every interaction was tinged with the underlying question, does she really belong here? And then there were the countless microaggressions she faced as First Lady. The polite smiles that didn't reach the eyes, the coded comments, the whispers. She had carried it all with grace, knowing that every move she made would be dissected, every word analyzed. But it hadn't been easy. Each slight, no matter how small, had chipped away at her, forcing her to rebuild her strength again and again. Yet as Michelle reflected on these moments, she also drew from them a quiet strength. These experiences hadn't broken her, they had shaped her. They had taught her to stand tall, to meet prejudice with dignity and resilience. Amanda's behavior, though hurtful, was just another chapter in a story she had faced many times before. Michelle looked out the window, her reflection staring back at her. She wouldn't let Amanda's actions define her. No, she would rise above it, just as she always had. Her worth wasn't determined by anyone else's perception. It was rooted in the unwavering knowledge of who she was. James sat silently for as long as he could, watching Amanda's behavior with growing discomfort. Each time she dismissed Michelle or brushed off her polite requests, his frown deepened, The difference in how Amanda treated Michelle compared to the other passengers wasn't just noticeable, it was glaring. He glanced around the cabin, catching the puzzled expressions of other passengers, their murmurs feeding the tension in the air. Finally, he decided enough was enough. "Excuse me, miss," James called out as Amanda walked past his row. His voice was calm but firm, carrying the weight of his disapproval. Amanda stopped, turning to him with her practiced smile. "Yes, sir? How can I help you?" James gestured toward Michelle. "I couldn't help but notice that you've been dismissing this lady's requests while providing excellent service to everyone else. Is there a reason for that?" Amanda's smile faltered for a split second before she quickly recovered. "Sir, I'm simply following protocol," she replied, her tone clipped. "We have a lot of passengers to serve, and I'm doing my best to accommodate everyone." James raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "Following protocol? Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like you're going out of your way to ignore her." His voice remained polite, but there was an unmistakable edge of challenge in his words. Before Amanda could respond, Michelle spoke up, her voice calm but steady. "I've noticed it too," she said, her eyes meeting Amanda's. "I've tried to remain patient, but it's hard not to feel singled out when my requests are consistently overlooked." Amanda's demeanor grew colder. She refused to meet Michelle's gaze, instead turning her attention to the tray she carried, as if it were the most important thing in the world. "I assure you, ma'am." "It's not personal," she said briskly, already stepping away. "I'll get to you when I can." Her words hung in the air, their dismissiveness louder than any argument she could have made. Michelle exchanged a glance with James, her calm exterior masking the frustration building inside her. Around them, the cabin grew quieter, the unease spreading as passengers absorbed what they had just witnessed. The blatant disregard Amanda displayed was now impossible to ignore. Her indifference wasn't just an isolated interaction, it was a statement. The tension in the room thickened as more passengers began to notice, their whispers slowing, replaced by uncomfortable silence. Each ignored word, each dismissive gesture, only amplified the disrespect, leaving the cabin on edge, waiting for someone to finally act. As Michelle sat in her seat, her calm composure belied the weight of the moment. Amanda's dismissive behavior wasn't just a personal slight. It was a reminder of something far deeper, a reflection of the systemic racism that shaped the world. Michelle navigated every day. Amanda's actions weren't isolated. They were part of a larger pattern of prejudice that seeped into the most ordinary interactions. Making spaces like this, spaces meant for comfort and privilege, fraught with discomfort and quiet exclusion. Michelle thought about how this moment was one of countless others she had experienced, each different but painfully familiar. Overt hostility was rare. What was far more common and more insidious were the microaggressions, the subtle assumptions that she didn't belong, the quiet dismissals that questioned her presence, the coded language that hinted she was out of place. These weren't just personal slights. They were societal echoes, whispers of a world that had long placed limits on her worth. Amanda's behavior, though veiled in politeness, was a symptom of these deeper prejudices. The way she served others, with warmth, while offering Michelle only indifference, mirrored how society often reserved respect and value for those who fit a narrow mold of belonging. To Amanda, Michelle wasn't just another passenger. She was someone whose presence disrupted her perception of what first class should look like. The cabin around Michelle was a microcosm of a much larger problem. Passengers noticed the disparity but hesitated to act, their silence amplifying the injustice. This hesitation wasn't just fear of confrontation, it was a reflection of how ingrained prejudice could be, how easy it was to turn a blind eye when the issue wasn't directly affecting them. For Michelle, this wasn't just about Amanda, It was about a system that had normalized these interactions, leaving her to carry the burden of remaining graceful in the face of subtle, persistent discrimination. It wasn't the first time, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But as Michelle straightened her shoulders, she resolved to face it, knowing that her resilience wasn't just for her. It was a quiet defiance against a system that demanded. She proved her worth again and again. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin grew heavier with each passing moment. Amanda's repeated dismissals of Michelle and her increasingly blatant favoritism toward other passengers were impossible to ignore. What had started as quiet whispers among a few passengers was now a wave of murmurs rippling through the cabin. The collective unease was palpable, with heads turning and eyes narrowing as Amanda moved through the aisle. A man seated 2 rows ahead leaned toward his companion, his voice no longer hushed. "Do you see how she's treating her? It's not right," he said, his words tinged with frustration. Across the aisle, a woman muttered to her partner, "I can't believe no one said anything yet." Amanda, either unaware of or deliberately ignoring the growing attention, continued to serve other passengers with her exaggerated friendliness. Her tone remained bright and cheerful as she handed out refills and responded warmly to even the smallest requests. But when she passed Michelle's row, she didn't so much as glance in her direction, her avoidance glaringly obvious to everyone watching. Michelle felt the weight of the cabin's attention bearing down on her. She had tried to remain composed, to de-escalate the situation with grace, but the pointed stares and rising tension around her made it clear that silence was no longer an option. Taking a deep breath, she steadied herself, preparing for what she knew was inevitable. She glanced briefly at James, seated nearby, whose supportive expression gave her the smallest measure of comfort. She had spent a lifetime navigating moments like this, but it never got easier. Confrontation wasn't her first instinct, it rarely was, but Amanda's behavior had reached a breaking point, and the energy in the cabin made it clear. This moment could no longer be ignored. As Amanda passed her row once again, Michelle sat straighter, gathering the strength she knew she would need to speak up. The whispers in the cabin slowed, the anticipation rising as everyone waited to see what would happen next. The tension had reached its peak, and the moment of reckoning was near. Do you think Amanda's actions reflect broader societal issues? What would you do if you witnessed such behavior? Share your thoughts below. James had watched quietly for as long as he could. Each dismissive interaction, each curt response Amanda directed toward Michelle, had chipped away at his patience. It wasn't just disrespect. It was an insult that everyone could see, but no one had addressed. He glanced around the cabin, noticing the uneasy expressions and whispered conversations among the other passengers. It was clear they saw it too, but their silence hung heavily in the air. James knew someone had to say something, and if no one else would, he would. He stood up from his seat, his movements deliberate, drawing the attention of those nearby. "Excuse me?" he called out, his deep voice cutting through the hum of the cabin. All eyes turned toward him, and even Amanda paused mid-step. She turned to face him, her smile faltering for the briefest moment. "Yes, sir?" she asked, her tone straining to remain professional. James gestured toward Michelle, his expression calm, but his voice unwavering. "Why are you treating her differently from everyone else?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. A murmur rippled through the cabin, passengers leaning closer to listen. Amanda's smile tightened as she quickly tried to deflect. "I'm sorry if it seemed that way, sir," she said, her tone clipped but polite. "I'm simply following protocol. We have a lot of passengers to attend to." James raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "Following protocol?" he repeated, his voice firm but measured. "Because it doesn't look like protocol to me. It looks like you're going out of your way to ignore her." The tension in the cabin peaked as Amanda's composure began to crack. Her cheeks flushed. slightly, and she shifted uncomfortably under the weight of James's steady gaze. "I assure you, sir, that's not my intention," she replied, her voice losing its polished edge. "I'm just trying to manage my duties as best I can." James crossed his arms, his expression unwavering. "Well, it seems like you've been managing just fine with everyone else, so why not extend the same courtesy to her?" His words echoed the thoughts of every passenger who had been silently watching. The cabin grew quieter, the anticipation thick in the air. Amanda looked around, her eyes darting nervously as she struggled to maintain control of the situation. For the first time, her authority was being questioned, and she seemed unsure how to respond. All eyes were now on her, waiting to see what she would do. As the tension in the cabin reached its peak, Michelle decided it was time to break her silence. She had spent the entire flight trying to rise above Amanda's behavior, letting her composure speak louder than confrontation. But now, as James's voice echoed in the air and Amanda's weak explanations faltered, Michelle knew the moment had come. With a calm yet steady voice, she turned to Amanda, her tone gentle but carrying an unmistakable authority. "Do you even know who I am?" she asked, her words cutting through the thick silence in the cabin. Amanda froze, her usual polished demeanor suddenly faltering. She opened her mouth to respond, but couldn't seem to find the words. Her discomfort was palpable as she looked at Michelle, truly seeing her for the first time since the flight began. "I'll tell you," Michelle continued, her voice steady and measured. "My name is Michelleobama. I am an author, an advocate, and a former First Lady of the United States of America." The cabin went completely silent. Passengers who had been whispering moments earlier now sat frozen, their gazes locked on Michelle. A collective gasp rippled through the rows as the realization spread. Some passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances, while others stared openly, their shock evident. Amanda's face turned a deep shade of crimson, her carefully crafted confidence crumbling under the weight of Michelle's revelation. For the first time, she seemed to truly understand the gravity of her actions. She tried to form a response, but the words caught in her throat. Michelle held her gaze, her composure unshaken. "I've spent my life working to create spaces where respect and dignity are not optional," she said. "And I'm here in this seat because I earned it, just like everyone else here has." The weight of Michelle's words hung in the air, undeniable and powerful. Amanda's behavior, once whispered about, was now laid bare for all to see. The realization of her actions and the person she had chosen to disrespect crashed down on her with full force. Michelle rose from her seat with quiet dignity, her movements deliberate and unhurried. The cabin, already hushed, seemed to grow, even quieter as every passenger turned their attention to her. Amanda stood frozen, her discomfort evident, while Michelle's calm yet resolute presence filled the space. "I want to say something," Michelle began, her voice steady but carrying a depth of emotion that immediately commanded the room. She glanced around the cabin, meeting the eyes of passengers who now watched her with rapt attention. "What happened here today? It's not new to me. It's not an isolated moment, and it's not just about me." She turned slightly toward Amanda, her gaze firm but not unkind. "This isn't about a glass of water or a dismissive tone. This is about something far deeper. It's about the assumptions we make about people based on how they look, where they come from, or who we think they are. And those assumptions, those subtle actions, speak louder than words ever could." Michelle paused, letting her words settle over the cabin before continuing. "I've been in spaces like this my entire life. Spaces where I've had to work twice as hard to prove that I belong. Spaces where my presence is questioned, not because of anything I've done, but because of what someone else perceives when they look at me." Her voice softened, tinged with sadness. And if this can happen to me, imagine how often it happens to those who don't have the same platform or visibility." Passengers began nodding, their faces reflecting understanding and guilt. Michelle's words resonated deeply, pulling at emotions that many had perhaps ignored or never fully understood. A young woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, while James sat with his arms crossed, nodding in quiet agreement. "Racism isn't always loud," Michelle continued. "It's not always in the form of harsh words or blatant acts of exclusion. Sometimes it's the little things, those microaggressions that people think go unnoticed, but they're felt, they matter, and they leave scars." Michelle's voice grew stronger, filled with conviction. "We all have a responsibility to do better, to challenge our own biases, to treat others with dignity and respect, not because of their title, but because they are human beings." The cabin remained silent as Michelle sat down, her words a call to action that echoed in every corner. The silence wasn't awkward, it was heavy with reflection. Amanda stood frozen, her face pale and her confidence visibly shaken. The weight of the cabin's collective attention bore down on her as she scrambled to respond. She glanced nervously around, her usual polished demeanor crumbling under the pressure. When she finally spoke, her voice was uneven, the practiced cheerfulness replaced by a defensive tone. I was just following protocol," she stammered, her eyes darting between Michelle and the other passengers. "We have policies in place to manage service in first class, and I didn't mean to offend anyone." She straightened slightly, as if willing herself to regain control, but her trembling voice betrayed her discomfort. Her words hung awkwardly in the air, doing little to quell the rising disapproval around her. Passengers exchanged skeptical glances, their expressions a mix of disbelief and frustration. Amanda's defense, though framed as a justification, only made her actions seem more deliberate. The phrase "following protocol" rang hollow, an excuse that couldn't mask the pattern of behavior everyone had witnessed. "I treat all passengers equally," Amanda added, her voice cracking slightly as she tried to reclaim authority. "I didn't mean to single anyone out." Michelle remained composed, her silence more powerful than any immediate rebuttal. The passengers, however, were less restrained. A man seated near the front muttered, "Protocol doesn't explain ignoring someone repeatedly." Another woman chimed in softly, "We all saw how differently you treated her." Amanda's face flushed a deep red as she realized the entire cabin had turned against her. Her inability to acknowledge the underlying prejudice in her actions left her exposed, her excuses doing little to stem the tide of disapproval. For the first time, Amanda seemed to fully grasp the impact of her behavior, standing at the center of a storm she had created but could no longer control. As the tension in the cabin reached its peak, the captain emerged from the cockpit, his presence immediately commanding attention. The murmurs among the passengers quieted, and all eyes turned to him as he approached the center of the conflict. His expression was calm but firm, a clear signal that he was there to restore order. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady but carrying a serious undertone. "I understand there has been an issue in this cabin, and I'd like to address it." He turned to Amanda, his gaze stern but controlled. "I've been informed by several passengers and staff members that there have been complaints regarding your behavior." The words were precise, leaving no room for misinterpretation. "I've also heard Mrs. Obama's account of what transpired." Amanda opened her mouth to speak, but the captain raised his hand to stop her. "I don't need explanations right now. What I need is accountability." His tone sharpened slightly as he added, "Your actions reflect poorly on this airline and its commitment to providing respectful service to all passengers, regardless of who they are." He then turned to Michelle, his demeanor softening. Mrs. Obama, on behalf of the airline, I want to extend my sincerest apologies for the way you've been treated. This is not acceptable, and I assure you we will be addressing this matter appropriately. The captain faced the passengers, offering a resolute statement. This airline does not tolerate discrimination of any kind. Please rest assured that this behavior will be dealt with swiftly. His intervention, firm and decisive, marked a clear turning point. Amanda's fate was now sealed, and the cabin began to settle, a sense of justice slowly returning to the air. As the confrontation settled, a calm stillness hung in the cabin, but it was soon broken by a quiet yet powerful voice. James, still seated across the aisle, spoke up, his tone reflective and steady. "You know," he began, addressing no one in particular but drawing the attention of everyone nearby, "I remember being a young boy, walking into a store and being followed around by the clerk. No matter how polite I was, they still saw me as a threat." His words resonated deeply, and the silence in the cabin encouraged others to join in. A woman in the middle row nodded, her voice soft but clear. "I felt that too. I work in corporate, and sometimes it feels like no matter how hard I work, I'm always being judged more harshly than my peers." Another passenger, a younger man sitting toward the front, added his perspective. "It's not always big things. Sometimes it's the looks, the questions about whether I really earned my position. It wears you down over time." The atmosphere in the cabin began to shift. What had started as an uncomfortable confrontation transformed into a shared moment of reflection. Passengers, emboldened by Michelle's earlier words, began to connect over their experiences, each story adding depth to the conversation. Michelle listened quietly, her heart full as she realized the impact her words had sparked. The cabin had become more than just a space for travel. It had become a space for healing and solidarity. Have you ever witnessed someone standing up to injustice? How did it inspire you to take action? Share your story in the comments below. Plane touched down smoothly, but the tension from the flight lingered in the air. Passengers exchanged glances, knowing the events that had unfolded were far from resolved. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, thanking everyone for their patience and professionalism, but there was an unspoken acknowledgement in his tone, a recognition of the gravity of what had transpired. As the cabin door opened, Amanda's demeanor was a stark contrast to the confidence she had exuded earlier. Her shoulders slumped slightly, and her polished smile was nowhere to be found. The murmurs of passengers followed her as she made her way to the exit, escorted by a member of the ground team. Her earlier defiance had crumbled under the weight of accountability, leaving her visibly ashamed. Passengers watched her departure in silence, their expressions a mixture of satisfaction and relief. For many, her removal from the flight was a tangible reminder that actions have consequences, and the blatant disregard she had shown was not going to be ignored. The quiet applause that rippled through the cabin wasn't one of celebration. It was one of justice served. On the jet bridge, Amanda was met by a representative from the airline who spoke in measured tones. "Amanda, we've been informed of the events that took place on this flight. We're launching an immediate investigation into your behavior, and you are hereby placed on suspension until further notice." Her protests, though muted, went unheard as she was guided away. Back on the plane, Michelle remained seated, her expression calm and composed. She didn't look smug or triumphant. She never would. Instead, her focus remained on the broader issue at hand. She knew this moment wasn't about Amanda alone. It was about a much larger conversation that needed to happen, one about dignity, respect, and accountability. As passengers prepared to disembark, some turned to Michelle with quiet words of support. "Thank you for speaking up," one woman said. "You've given us all something to think about." Michelle responded with her characteristic warmth, offering a simple smile and a nod. The flight might have ended, but the impact of what had occurred was far from over. For everyone on board, it was clear this moment would ripple far beyond the cabin. As passengers began filing off the plane, a young man seated a few rows behind Michelle discreetly tapped on his phone. He had captured Michelle's speech earlier in the flight, moved by her composure, eloquence, and the way she had addressed such a deeply rooted issue with grace and power. It wasn't planned. He had simply hit record, feeling the need to document the moment. Now, sitting at the gate, he debated for a brief moment before uploading the video with the caption, "Michelleobama addressing the truth we all need to hear. To racism, dignity for all." The video took on a life of its own almost immediately. Within minutes, likes, shares, and comments poured in from people across the globe. By the time Michelle had left the airport, the clip had been viewed over 1 million times, its reach spreading like wildfire across social media platforms. Hashtags like "We Stand With Michelle" and "End Discrimination" began trending, sparking conversations about systemic racism, microaggressions, and the subtle yet pervasive biases that so many had experienced but few had confronted so openly. The responses were overwhelming. Some viewers shared their own stories of being dismissed or judged based on their appearance, while others expressed outrage at Amanda's behavior and called for greater accountability in the airline industry. "This isn't just about one flight or one person," one comment read. "It's about the way we treat people every single day, and it's time for change." News outlets quickly picked up the story, replaying Michelle's speech alongside interviews with passengers who'd been on the flight. Experts weighed in, discussing the broader implications of systemic racism and the ways microaggressions perpetuate inequality. The clip became more than just a viral moment. It became a rallying cry. Across the globe, Michelle's words resonated deeply with those who had felt silenced or dismissed. Activists, community leaders, and everyday people joined the conversation, many referencing Michelle's speech as a turning point. Her poise and authenticity gave voice to experiences often ignored, uniting individuals in their shared determination to confront prejudice wherever it existed. Unaware of the growing global impact of her words, Michelle quietly reflected on the flight's events, her thoughts still centered on the need for empathy and action. Meanwhile, the world listened, inspired by her strength, and moved to take the conversation further than ever before. The viral video had reached millions within hours, and the public response was swift and overwhelming. Social media platforms buzzed with calls for accountability, tagging the airline in posts demanding answers. Prominent figures from politics, entertainment, and social justice joined the conversation, amplifying the outrage and pushing the company into the spotlight. The airline, initially slow to respond, soon realized the gravity of the situation and the urgency for action. By the next day, the airline issued a formal statement addressed directly to Michelleobama and the passengers on the flight. The CEO began the statement with a heartfelt apology. "We deeply regret the events that occurred on Flight 238 and the unacceptable treatment experienced by one of our passengers, Mrs. Michelleobama. This behavior does not reflect the values of our company or the standards we expect from our employees." The statement went on to acknowledge the systemic issues highlighted by the incident. "We recognize that this is not just about one employee's actions, but about a broader responsibility we have as an organization to address implicit bias and ensure that every passenger is treated with respect and dignity." In response to the backlash, the airline announced a series of measures aimed at fostering meaningful change. These included mandatory diversity, equity, and inclusion training for all employees, from entry-level staff to senior executives. The CEO also pledged to implement new accountability protocols to prevent similar incidents in the future. The apology was accompanied by a commitment to long-term change. "This is only the beginning. We are committed to rebuilding trust with our customers and creating an airline culture that values equality and inclusion." The public response to the apology was cautiously optimistic. Some praised the airline's transparency and its willingness to take action, while others expressed skepticism, demanding evidence of follow-through. A few days after the viral incident, Laura, one of Amanda's co-workers on the flight, decided it was time to share her story. Inspired by Michelle's courage and the public outcry, she reached out to a prominent news outlet for an interview, determined to shed light on the deeper issues within the airline's culture. Sitting across from the interviewer, Laura's voice was steady but filled with emotion as she recounted the events of the flight. "What happened to Mrs. Obama wasn't just an isolated incident," she began. "It's part of a much larger problem. This wasn't about one bad day or one person's actions. It's about a culture that unfortunately still allows biases to go unchecked." Laura revealed that she had observed similar patterns among her colleagues before. "There's this unspoken hierarchy," she explained. "Certain passengers are treated better because they're seen as important, while others are dismissed, sometimes just based on appearances. I've seen it happen, and I've stayed quiet because I didn't know how to speak up without risking my job." She paused, her gaze thoughtful. "But watching Mrs. Obama handle that situation with such grace made me realize that silence only perpetuates the problem. If we don't speak out, nothing will change." Laura went on to discuss the lack of meaningful diversity training within the airline and how it contributed to these systemic issues. "We're trained on customer service, but there's very little emphasis on understanding implicit bias or recognizing how our actions can harm others. That needs to change." She concluded by applauding Michelle for using her voice to highlight the issue. What she said that day wasn't just for her, it was for everyone who's ever felt dismissed or excluded. It inspired me to do the same. A follow-up interview. Michelle sat across from a journalist, her expression calm but contemplative as she reflected on the incident that had ignited a global conversation. The reporter began by asking her how she felt about the overwhelming response to her words. Michelle offered a small smile, her tone warm yet measured. "It's humbling," she said, "but it's also a reminder of just how far we still have to go." Michelle spoke candidly about the moment on the plane, acknowledging the pain it caused, but framing it as an opportunity for growth. "Experiences like that are never easy," she admitted. "They sting because they remind you that no matter how far you've come or what you've achieved, there are still people who will judge you by the surface, your race, your gender, your appearance, before they even bother to know who you are." Her voice grew more resolute as she continued, "But those moments, as painful as they are, can also be powerful. They force us to hold up a mirror, not just to ourselves, but to the systems and structures around us. And when we choose to approach those moments with grace and resilience, we turn them into opportunities to educate, to spark dialogue, and to push for change." Michelle emphasized the importance of empathy in confronting bias. "We can't just respond to prejudice with anger. We have to go deeper. We have to ask, why does this bias exist? What can we do to dismantle it? That takes education, understanding, and above all, a willingness to listen." She encouraged others to remain steadfast in the fight for equality, even when the challenges felt overwhelming. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she said. "It happens when we show up again and again with strength, dignity, and the conviction that we deserve better, because we do." The interviewer noted how poised Michelle had remained throughout the ordeal, asking how she maintained her composure. Michelle's response was simple but profound. "You can't let someone else's actions dictate who you are. Grace isn't just about staying calm, it's about staying true to yourself, even in the face of injustice. The story of Michelle's experience aboard the flight became more than just a moment of confrontation. It transformed into a global call for introspection and change. As the video of her speech continued to circulate, the ripple effect became undeniable. Communities, organizations, and individuals from all walks of life began to examine their own biases and the systems that perpetuated them. What struck people the most wasn't just the injustice Michelle faced, but how she chose to handle it. Her calm demeanor and carefully chosen words turned a painful moment into an opportunity for education and progress. People around the world saw not just her resilience, but her ability to rise above the situation with dignity, inspiring countless others to reflect on how they might respond to similar challenges. Articles and opinion pieces flooded social media and news outlets, many of them focusing on the power of small acts of resistance. A school teacher in Atlanta used Michelle's story to teach her students about implicit bias and empathy. A CEO in London pledged to implement diversity training across her company, citing the incident as a wake-up call. Local community groups in cities from New York to Sydney hosted forums to discuss microaggressions, using the video as a starting point for their conversations. In neighborhoods and boardrooms, the conversation shifted. Michelle's experience highlighted the importance of confronting prejudice in everyday moments, not just through grand gestures, but through the collective actions of individuals. As one commenter wrote, "Change begins when we stop being silent." Michelle didn't just stand up for herself, she stood up for all of us. The story ended not with anger, but with hope, a powerful testament to how adversity, when met with grace and strength, can pave the way for a brighter, more equitable future for all. What would you say to someone who dismisses others based on stereotypes? How do you think we can encourage change? Share your thoughts below. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories that highlight the power of resilience and justice. Together, we can create a more equitable world. See you in the next story.